You're listening to INTERZONE Pod. My name is Gareth Jelley. I'm the editor of INTERZONE and IZ Digital. You can find out more about INTERZONE at interzone.press and more about its sister zine, IZ Digital, at interzone.digital. Today on the show, I'm talking to Gareth L. Powell. Hello, Gareth. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Your love of science fiction is kind of comes through in your writing. You talk about classic science fiction a lot in your newsletter and in social media. And there's a nod to H.G. Wells in Stars and Bones, the first continuance novel, the intellect's vast and cool and sympathetic line. I kind of wonder what are your earliest memories of science fiction?
Oh, well, I mean, you'd have to go right back to the very early 70s. Before I started school, I was watching Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's probably the first time it was shown in the UK. I was watching that on an old black and white TV. I was probably about 3 or 4. I didn't understand all of it, but I loved it. Absolutely loved it. And then from there, I was just always interested in space. And Star Wars came out when I was 7, so... Yeah, obviously I was lost from then on. Star Trek, Star Wars, and the Battlestar Galactica TV series, Doctor Who, Blake 7. And then on, we were seeing footage of astronauts flying around in zero gravity in Skylab, and I remember the Apollo-Soyuz link-up flight. It was just, it seemed a foregone conclusion that we were all going to be living on Mars by the year 2000. So, I've always been, into it. And written wise, the first sci-fi books I can remember is a very old one called You Will Go to the Moon.
Oh, okay. Which
went into great detail about how you would get to the moon and how you would live there. And then there was a series of books by Brian Earnshaw about a starship called the Dragonfall 5. And the family that lived on it, it was a broken down old freighter, and they lived from adventure to adventure in this old freighter, which I absolutely adored those as a child. And from there, I just got into the whole rest of the canon. Where I had a local library that had a huge sci-fi section, and I just worked my way through it. So Heinlein, Clarke, everything they had, and this was in the kind of early 80s. Larry Niven, yeah. So, yeah, I've got a pretty good grounding in the genre.
So it was everything from sort of the far future stuff of Star Wars or and also the sort of space fantasy stuff of Star Wars, and also Star Trek, and then the real world science as well.
Yeah, and then there was also the stuff like John Wyndham's Day of the Triffids, and the 1980s BBC adaptation of that, and then The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy as well. On the radio and on the TV. So, yeah, I mean, it was, looking back, it was a bumper time for sci-fi. It was everywhere.
Yeah, definitely. Do you remember when you first thought, I want to do that? When you were reading that, you thought, I want to write, I want to be a writer.
I don't remember the first time. I always enjoyed writing. And when I was probably about 7 or 8 years old, maybe 9. I had an ongoing trilogy of novels that I was writing, and what it basically was I had like reporters' spiral top notebooks, and I would start on page 1 and write this fantastic adventure, kind of based on what had ever happened on Blake 7 the previous night, and just crammed it all in there. And then when I reached the end of the notebook, that was the end of the novel, and it was time. So I'd get another notebook and write part 2 in massive letters. And that would be the next one. I just, and I think I did 3 or 4 of those.
And you were thinking in trilogies then as well?
Yeah, well, because, Star Wars came out in a trilogy. And so, it just seemed to be everything had to be a trilogy. So.
Right. And also the kind of there's the episodic stuff. You mentioned Battlestar Galactica, and Star Trek, and and Blake 7, of course. That kind of episodic way of telling stories as well is I think, a really big influence, particularly if you were watching TV at that time.
Absolutely. Although with Battlestar Galactica, they chopped down a few of the early episodes and made a feature-length movie. I saw that at school when we had like a film night. They projected things up, and so they projected up the movie-length Battlestar Galactica, which was amazing. And then
wow, okay,
Watership Down, which traumatized us all. So.
Watership Down recently got uprated, I think, didn't it? From I think after many sort of years of people saying it shouldn't be a U. A Universal is the kind of rating in the UK for, anyone can watch it, and I think recently it just got bumped up to PG or something.
Yeah, about time.
Yeah, maybe a generation or two too late.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's that kind of strain of horror, I suppose, there as well. And then what were those sort of first steps then, later in terms of, getting published and writing, starting it as a career?
Yeah, I did a creative writing course at university. In fact, it coincidentally, I was in the same class as Rob Williams, who now writes for 2000 AD in DC.
Okay.
And yeah, and I basically spent the time there writing very overwrought short stories and absolutely dreadful poetry. And, kind of thought I would like to be a writer because I'm not suited for any other job. And, but I had to go out and get other jobs. So I wrote for a while and, in the spare time, if you aborted starts at writing novels and a few short stories. Mm-hmm. But then, sort of 10 years later, I was kind of looking down the barrel of turning 30, and it was the turn of the millennium as well. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, it's time to do it or get off the pot. And so I sat down and I wrote a novel, which was Silver Sands, which was quite a short novel. And then I sent it out to a few agents, and a few of them said quite nice things about it, but nobody was interested in taking me on as a client. So I put it in a drawer and I wrote short stories for a while. And I had a few on websites and a few in like fanzines and things. But then I got a break in 2005, I think, when I had a story accepted by INTERZONE. And that story, The Last Reef, was very well received. And so I wrote another one, which was called Akak Makak, from which a later trilogy emerged. But on the basis of those two stories, and I think Akak Makak won the readers' poll for that year for favourite story. And on the back of that, I had a publisher, small press, approach me and say, have you got any novels or anything you'd like us to publish? And so I dug Silver Sands out, gave it a quick spruce up and sent it off, and they accepted it. And then at the same time, another small press, Elastic Press, approached me and said, really like your short stories. Do you want to put out a collection? So I said, well, of course I do. So I madly scribbled lots more short stories. And the collection came out in 2008, called The Last Reef and Other Stories. Elastic Press has since gone under, I'm afraid. So I had to republish it myself on Amazon. But a lot of the stories in it will be included in the new Uber collection I have coming out from Titan Books in 2025, which is kind of a huge retrospective. But and then the novel came out in 2010, and at that point I caught the eye of Solaris Books and pitched them a novel, and they said yes. So I wrote it very quickly. It was called The Recollection. It came out in 2011, and then I wrote 3 Monkey books, and here we are. So
yeah, here we are, and big deals and all sorts of things happening. The Silver Sands was received well. I was talking with some writers about the late great Eric Brown recently for a special episode of the show, and in his review, Brown said of The Recollection that it's beautifully balanced between big ideas and the smaller scale human story. Is that what you've always been striving for in your stories, that balance.
Absolutely. Oh, I mean, my kind of blueprint, if you like, is the movie Alien, where there's these big concepts and there's these, terrifying stuff and all the weirdness. But at the heart of it, it's like just a group of normal people, and you get to know them and you see everything through their eyes. And so what I very early tried to do was, in the recollection, I made one of the characters a London cab driver who has fallen through time 400 years, so that we get to experience this weird future through a pair of eyes who are familiar with our world. So he's like our guide, our proxy into that future. So, yeah, I mean, for me, characters are the most important part of the book. And if I have some characters I enjoy writing about, characters I can trust to make decisions that will, propel the book in vaguely the right direction, and characters through which I can say something about what it means to be human and what it means to lose people and what it means to find people and what it means to, just exist in this vast and baffling universe.
Right. You mentioned sort of seeing things through people's eyes, and you've written a lot. You use first person a lot, and I saw just today actually you've published an edition of your newsletter about deciding between first, second, and third person narrative.
Yeah.
What do you think it is that drew you to that for Embers of War and for the Continuance books?
Well, before that, I wrote sort of 5 novels in sort of traditional third person, and it was fine. But with Embers of War, I decided to try it in first person. I started it in third person, but I read Emma Newman's book Planetfall. Well, I read a very early draft she sent to me in Word. It had a different title and everything, but I read it, and that was completely written in first person. And before then, I hadn't really thought that you could write a whole novel in first person. And I read that, and it just a light bulb seemed to go on in my head. And suddenly I sort of sat down and rewrote the opening of Embers of War in first person, and it just flew out. The entire book just flew out because suddenly I wasn't telling the story. Suddenly the characters were telling the story. And I just had to, almost like an actor, just get into character and just, vomit out what these people were thinking. And it seemed to suit me very well, and I wrote very quickly, and I enjoyed it a lot. So, I mean, I will probably go back to third person at some point, because at this point I've written 7 novels in first person or something. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to be a one-trick pony, but I find that kind of that ability just to channel the characters and to talk as them and to have them talking directly to the reader is just seems to suit the sort of mad, weird ideas that I'm surrounding them with. Because there's these huge concepts, these giant machines, these weird ancient alien things, and just to have the characters sort of talk to the reader and say, this is really weird.
Right.
It kind of, I think it makes it more immediate. I know some people hate it, but I think it's worked very well for these stories.
You mentioned kind of getting into the character, kind of, sort of maybe hearing them. Do those sort of big, wild ideas come first, or do the characters in the situations come first, or are they kind of emerging in parallel?
Kind of in parallel. I'll sort of come up with an idea for a vague sort of plot or a weird sort of thing that I want to explore. And then I'll have to find a character, and then the nature of the characters dictates more about the nature of the universe and so on. I wanted to have, for Embers of War, I wanted to have a retired battleship. And so in order to have a battleship, why would a battleship retire? So there had to be something that happened in the war. So I had to have a war. And in order to have a war, I needed to come up with two societies that would have to have had a war. And so all the background and a lot of the plot came about as I was creating this world for this character to exist in. So it's kind of, Yeah, and as well, usually when I'll have a vague idea of what the ending of a book will be, but when I get there, I often find it's quite different from what I was expecting because the characters have made choices along the way, and that can lead down different paths.
And the characters, I guess, must change as well as you're writing them, because you find out more about them, and you put them through different ringers. And I mean, is that something you found as well, that the novels have to change because the characters change?
Yeah, I'm not one of these writers who sits down and fills out like a D&D character sheet for every character before I start. I'll have a vague idea who they are, but they sort of come alive as I write them, and as they tell their story, things will surface from their past, and that will affect the decisions they make going forward and so on. So it's, I hate the term, it's a very organic process, but it's a very organic process. It just sounds so pretentious, but it sort of happens as I go along. I kind of make it all up as I go along. But yeah, it's it's the clay shapes itself as it's being tortured metaphors.
You wrote half of Stars and Bones before the pandemic and half during the pandemic, I think.
Yeah,
and then in Descendant. Well, and obviously that kind of affected that book, and then Descendant Machine, which is the second continuance book, you lost it, or you lost what you'd written, and you had to kind of go back and start from scratch. Kind of looking back at that time, how much did external factors sort of feed into the fabric of the book? Do you feel those books for you are very much books of their time?
They are, and to be honest, external factors almost killed them both stone dead. I'd started Stars and Bones before the pandemic, but when the pandemic hit, I don't know if it was the stress, the ongoing stress and not knowing and everything, but I had this terrible brain fog. I couldn't read, I couldn't concentrate to read, and if I can't read, I can't write. And it was just, I was stuck in a house with two teenagers, not knowing, how things were going to go. I mean, we were all there, and it was a terribly uncertain time. And I think sometimes we forget how uncertain those early days were, the lockdown, first lockdown. But I just I seemed to lose all ability to concentrate. People were online saying, "Oh, we're locked down, and it's finally time to write that novel." And I was like, so I struggled. Honestly, it didn't help that it's a novel about an intelligent virus that, attacks a fleet of spaceships, and they have to all go into quarantine procedures. And, it was hitting a bit close to home. Mm-hmm. So, it was difficult. And I managed to finish it. I think I finished it 4 months late and handed it in to Titan, but they didn't mind because obviously they'd had to close their offices for the duration as well. And then I started on the next one, Descendant Machine, because it was contracted for 2 books. And I found it terribly hard going. It was like pulling teeth. It was because I was still caught in that kind of brain fog. Mm-hmm. I couldn't seem to motivate myself to think. And then I got 30,000 words in. It was like, and as you say, I lost the file. It disappeared. And at that point, I thought the last Stars and Bones and the first 30,000 words of this book have been so difficult, I don't know if I can do it again. And I was kind of like just lying on the sofa thinking, is this it? Can I get myself back from this? And, with the encouragement of Diane, who's now my wife, I started again from the beginning, and I wrote a different book than the one I had been writing, but a better book, and a more hopeful book in some ways. And it was still difficult, but it got easier as I went along. And once I got over that 30,000 words, it had started breaking new territory. It started to feel better. So, yeah, it was a horrifying process, but I think I came out of it with a better book than I would have done otherwise. Mm-hmm. And since then, I've written a whole other novel, Future's Edge, which is coming out from Titan in February 2025, but I've already written it and handed it in, so that came a lot easier. And, I think my mojo's coming back, and now I'm working on another novel as well. And, I wrote the first 15,000 words of that in a week. So the pace is coming back, and the kind of the fun and the joy of writing is coming back. So it's a huge relief.
Mm-hmm. You said that the kind of, when you restarted Descendant Machine, it was a different book, a more hopeful book. And there's this sort of tonal difference between the two, I suppose. The one has more of a kind of horror element to it, for sure, and it has that, and it also kind of has that it hinges on that loss, that sort of loss of someone very important. How did it change? I mean, what big differences were there between that lost version and the version we have?
The general kind of setup was the same, but I reused some characters from Stars and Bones, even though the books were supposed to be standalones, and it was feeling a bit clunky. I just wasn't feeling it, and I was finding it very difficult to write it. And so once I'd got over the kind of shock and grief of losing that amount of work, going back in with a blank slate was kind of liberating in a way. And I got away, because in Stars and Bones, it's set only like 50 years or 75 years, I can't remember which, since humanity lost the Earth. And so a lot of the characters are kind of affected by that, and the main relationship, the character who's lost a loved one, that's kind of reflected in the fact that humanity has lost the Earth, and she's lost her relation. And Descendant Machine, I moved it up the timeline another 50 or 70 years or whatever. So it's, much later now. So there's very, very, very few people left alive who remember the Earth. So the kind of the shock and the sort of cultural, the cultural depression or whatever, or sense of grief has dissipated a bit. And it's like, and so in some ways, I guess you could say it's because we were coming out of the pandemic, and that kind of, I moved it into a slightly more hopeful future. And where Stars and Bones, I set out to write a sci-fi horror story. Descendant Machine, although set in the same universe, is more a sci-fi thriller. So it's slightly different subgenres in some ways.
Yeah. In your interview at Run Along the Shelves with Womble, when asked what 3 words best describe the next continuance novel, you answered "not yet finished." And I'm wondering, Stars and Bones has that horror, and Descendant Machine looked at sort of, it is a different subgenre. Can you say much about the next one or not?
I can say that the next one, Future's Edge, is not actually set in the continuance universe at all. It's we had a change of heart. The continuance is remaining a duology for the moment until I think of another story that would suit that universe.
Okay.
The next story I wanted to tell didn't fit in there, or I could have fitted it in there, but I'd have to crowbar it in, and it wouldn't have been a very good fit. So I sort of decided to move on to an entirely new.
I knew Future's Edge was a new universe. I thought that the other one you were working on was Continuance, but Continuance is currently sort of sitting as a duology, right?
It is, yes. The Future's Edge is a brand new one, and the one I'm currently working on, that's currently on submission to various publishers, is another universe again.
Ah,
so
okay.
There's many universes. So I kind of I like setting. I like a series as well as anybody, but after 3 books in Embers of War, I wanted to change, and after 2 books in the Continuance series, I wanted to change. So it's, because I like coming up with new situations, and sometimes the baggage from previous books in a series prevents you telling the story you want to tell, because you can't, especially if you've accidentally blown up the universe at the end of book 3 or something. But, so yeah, the Future's Edge is like, I describe it as sort of Casablanca set in space, and but it's much bigger than that, and it's more kind of scary, and there's physics that are things going on in physics that are causing huge problems, and it's more of a kind of alien invasion / I'd say it's a war novel, but you don't see much of the war. It's all taking place away from the war. So it's it's a different beast, but it's still got all the action. It's still got people zooming hither and thither in starships, and anyone who's enjoyed my last 5 books will very much enjoy it. So.
I mean, you've been writing, you've been publishing for a while now. Do you feel that it's getting easier or more difficult to sell series? Did you feel like sort of standalones are kind of maybe more marketable, or that just publishers are more keen to take them, or do you not see a change?
This was a discussion I had with Titan Books, in that they weren't overly keen on a new trilogy after Embers, because what happens with trilogies is there's always a fall off by the 3rd book. So the first book sells very well, but not everyone goes on to the second book, and then not everyone goes on to the 3rd book. So there's a slight drop in sales, because also if people wander into a bookshop and pick up a book and think, well, this looks interesting, and then they realize, oh, I've got to buy the first 2 before I can read this one, it's kind of a disincentive. So, unless you're, a massive name, then a series is probably more of a hard sell at the moment than a standalone, because at least with a standalone, you can publicize it more than you can publicize like the second book in a trilogy, which is harder to get reviews of, and it's harder to publicize without spoilers for the first one. And so we decided to try an experiment, which was the Continuance universe, which was a number of standalone novels but set in the same universe, sort of like Ian Banks's Culture novels, where you can more or less read them in any order. So we could just say, here's a new book, buy this new book. It's a new book. You don't have to know, you don't have to have read the previous books. You don't have to know the background. You can just pick each one up and read it in whatever order you fancy. And I think that is a pretty valid approach, to be honest. I can, I'd like the security of writing another series, but at the same time, having a new standalone book to promote and a new story to tell each time, new characters to meet each time, is a lot of fun.
Yeah, I was going to say, is it more fun? Is it creatively? Is it more fun to sort of be laying out these new universes and to not have to worry about the other things you've written and how they fit together?
Absolutely. I mean, I loved writing the Embers of War trilogy because in the second book I didn't have to set up the characters or anything. I could just open the book and think, right, what are these guys up to now? And away I went. So I didn't have to invent everything from whole cloth again. But at the same time, yeah, I like the variety of coming up with new stories and new setups and new universes, and both have their challenges, but both are a lot of fun, I think.
Have you ever thought of writing in in an established universe, or is that something you would consider taking? You mentioned Alien before. Is that sort of on the bucket list?
Not really. I've been approached by a couple of properties, one of which I can't mention because there's an NDA, to do novelizations of various, properties that they have. But I find it very difficult. I find it very difficult indeed to tell stories using other people's stuff. I would love to be able to say, yes, brilliant, I will write a Doctor Who, or write a Star Wars, or what have you, write a Star Trek. And I've got lots of ideas for stuff that could happen in there, but actually sitting down and writing a novel using other people's rules, I find incredibly difficult. And besides, I think I'm building up, I'm working on novel number 13, 12, 13, something like that. And, I've got, to use another term I really despise. I've got a brand, and people know what a Gareth L. Powell book will give them in a lot of ways. I hope to surprise them in some ways, but at the same time, I hope they also know they're going to get an exciting story, some kind of deeper speculations, and some interesting, flawed, complex characters. And I want to keep doing that. And I think to take on somebody else's universe, to, for instance, write Star Trek or something, using those characters, I could do it because, I know those characters, I know that world, I enjoy that world, but it wouldn't feel like me. It wouldn't, it wouldn't be, I wouldn't be writing from the heart. I'd be writing from the kind of my inner fanboy. And I would find that very difficult because part of the fun I have is developing the characters on the page. And so using characters that are already very well developed and the audience already know very well, and having to sort of mimic that and stick in those boundaries, I would find it very hard to tell that kind of story, I think.
Right. Yeah, no, that all makes sense. It's funnily enough, you're the second person this week to mention blowing up a universe, which I guess only happens when you're doing conversations about science fiction. Because I was talking to Una McCormack for the Eric Brown show, and she mentioned kind of basically blowing up the universe that she was writing in, that sort of Eric Brown had started. And so, yeah, I guess that you also have that freedom to just destroy the whole world, which you can't do when you're writing inside a particular franchise.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you're writing on a big canvas with space opera or something, you have the biggest canvas. You have the entirety of time and space as your canvas. So you have to have very big threats and very big consequences and very big things to struggle against. So, the possibility of the universe blowing up at any moment is obviously, pretty much the biggest threat you can get. So, yeah.
Yeah. Future's Edge is 2025, and that's part of a 2-book deal with Titan, and the other one is this kind of collection you mentioned earlier, the Who Will You Save?
Yes.
Which is also later in 2025. Do you already have a fairly sort of firm table of contents for that and sequence in that? Is it going to be chronological or something else?
It's not been edited yet, but I did send Kath, my editor, an enormous Word document with I think 110,000 words of short stories or something, and in order. And I was like, I was fairly like, this is the order I want to do, because I did it like I'm going to be terribly old fashioned now and say a mixtape or playlist for you younger viewers. And so it's, you put an absolute banger up first to get the crowd going, and then you take it up a notch, and then you sort of then you take it down a bit, and then you build back up. So it's like structuring a mixtape. It's getting those, getting the themes and the pacing and everything. And so, yeah, hopefully it should be good. And I wrote a few new stories for it as well. There are some short stories set in the Embers of War universe, and there are some short stories set in the Continuance universe in there, as well as lots of my kind of best loved old stuff, some stuff that's never been collected, and some stuff that appeared in my previous collections. So it's kind of almost like a kind of career retrospective of all my short work over the last 20 years. So.
Okay. That's a big one to look forward to then.
Yeah, and my previous collections were both from small presses and both had print runs of like 300. So having this out through Titan is now a chance for a much wider readership to read a very important part of my work that maybe hasn't been as widely available, because some of this stuff just appeared in a magazine and 10, 15 years ago. And if you didn't read that magazine, you've never read it. So I think it will add a whole new dimension to the novels, because you'll see how my writing was changing as I was writing the novels and then writing these short stories alongside them.
Are you tempted to go back and sort of make changes, or are you being quite kind of strict and leaving them as they are?
I am being quite kind of lazy and leaving them as they are. I have no doubt that, when they go through the editing process, there will be a few kind of cosmetic changes and a few, maybe the odd bit here and there. But I think it would be slightly dishonest maybe to kind of rewrite them all. From where I am now, it would be... I want a more authentic collection, as I say, that shows how my style has, what bits of it have always been there, what bits of it have developed, and I think that is feels more interesting and authentic than just rewriting them all and sanitizing it.
Yeah. And probably also just a really, really starting to do that is like where do you stop as well? When you have a big collection. To just sort of sidestepping slightly, the Recollection was republished. Was that expanded, or was that the same book that had come out before?
That was the same book that had come out before. Solaris just decided to do a 10th anniversary edition.
Okay.
Because the Recollection had come out in 2011, and it was a space opera. But it got a bit forgotten because I did the Akak Makak trilogy after that. But then when Embers of War came out, and the Embers of War trilogy was coming out and was doing very well, they thought, well, we've got this space opera by Gareth Powell, and his space opera is doing well, so let's do a new edition, make it look a bit like the ones he's doing with Titan, and kind of bring that out. And it was good. I was glad to see it getting a second chance, because I was very fond of that book and I had a lot of fun writing it. So
you mentioned how the short stories are a kind of really important part of your development as a writer, and also when I interviewed you last year for IZ Digital, you mentioned, or you hinted that you might try some novellas, or you might be writing some novellas. At the moment, when you have ideas, do you sort of fairly early on know that this is a short story length idea, or this is a novel sized idea, or does that, or is it hard to know until you started writing it?
No, I very deliberately sit down and write a short story. I think, right, I'm going to write a short story. A novel takes a lot of thinking and a lot of work. I couldn't just start one and then, with novella. I wrote the novella Ragged Alice that was published by Tor.com. That was supposed to be a full-length kind of Lee Child style thriller that was going to make myself and my agent millionaires.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I went away and came back with a novella set in rural West Wales, featuring a spooky police procedural, and he was like, this is not what we discussed. So that was, and I was going to make it a novel, but then I got sort of about 2/3 of the way through and realized that I'd killed off everybody who could possibly be a murder suspect, so I had to wrap it up.
Oh, no.
And but I was really pleased with it. It's the people who've read it love it, and it's one of my favourites because it's very personal, because I put a lot of stuff about Wales and my Welsh heritage and stuff in there. But yeah, I think it came out through Tor.com, and I don't think it ever really found the right audience, because I don't think it was what people were expecting at all. But yeah, since then I've done the novella with Peter Hamilton, Light Chaser. And that was a whole lot of fun doing a novella with another author, especially one I looked up to when I was first starting out. So, and I self-published a novella as well because I wanted to. I serialized on my old Patreon page. When I closed my Patreon page down, I collected it together and published it through Amazon as well, so you can get it as print on demand through them.
What's the name of that one?
Downdraft. It's kind of Breaking Bad style fall from grace in a sci-fi horror world, but it's in the same universe as my Reef stories. It's like The Last Reef and those stories. So it's kind of it's in that universe. So it's fun.
That was the Patreon, which is I'd forgotten you had a Patreon, and then you switched from Patreon to Substack.
Yeah.
And you recently published a short story in an edition of the newsletter, and I kind of and it seems that you're kind of putting a lot of time and energy into the newsletter. I kind of wonder, what do you really enjoy, or what do you enjoy most about writing and publishing that?
Yeah, I mean, when I started, it was like I was going to use it because I have a monthly newsletter that just goes out every month, and it looked like a good platform to do that. So I did, but then it's kind of like a blog as well. So it's like a newsletter. So I do the newsletter, but then I also do blog topics. So you can, and so I've got various kind of categories. So I've got some lots of writing advice on there. I've got old columns that I wrote for the Engineer magazine about future technology, and I've got just general news about me and what I'm up to and stuff. So it very much quickly became a blog, and I sort of started posting several times a week, just writing, and I started doing sort of live readings on there for people. And occasionally once a month we have a video hangout. So over Zoom, where we can, people who subscribe to the newsletter can come and hang out and we chat, and it's usually a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of reignited my enjoyment of blogging, but it's also feeding into the fiction, in that if I get up and I'm feeling sluggish or whatever, and I sit down and I write a blog post for the newsletter, then it's kind of warmed me up, and I'm ready to then switch to the book, and I'm ready to go, because it's kind of, it keeps the motor running, I think. And it's, but also I seem to be building quite a nice community there. I've got about 2,500 people who subscribe to it. A very vastly smaller amount who subscribe to the paid content, which is the most of the writing advice. The stuff is behind a paywall where you have to pay, like, I think £5 a month or something to get access to it all. But that's just a little sideline to take the place of the income I used to get from Patreon.
Right.
Although it's not nowhere near as much as I used to get from Patreon, but times are tough for people. But I just really like using it as helping and doing what I always do, which is encouraging and offering advice, and saying, chuck a little bit in the tip jar for this advice, because I'm putting a lot of time into producing it for you. But yeah, I just enjoy using it. It's got a nice interface, and I think people seem to be appreciating it. So.
It's kind of interesting how, publishers and writers are kind of moving more towards, almost like building sort of fanzine type communities, in a smaller sense sometimes, or in a more kind of focused sense. It's really, it's an exciting time in lots of ways.
It is. One of the things I really like about it is there's a chat feature. So people who like read the blog posts and stuff, I can chat with them in this chat feature, and we can just it's like a SMS on your phone kind of deal. You type messages and replies and stuff, but that makes it really community thing, because you can get in there and you can chat, and it's private to the subscribers. So it's only people who subscribe to the magazine can read the chat. So it's that makes it feel very community, where people kind of chat and say, I really enjoyed that post, and it kicks off a discussion about that topic or something. And I've been using it to share Blue Skyed invite codes as well. So it's just a nice kind of community vibe.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Just going back slightly, you mentioned you did that novella with Peter Hamilton.
Yeah,
that you co-wrote. How did you find collaborating and sort of? I don't know actually how much you've done sort of co-writing before, but yeah, what was that process like, and did it sort of change the way you thought about anything?
Yeah, I mean, before I years ago I co-wrote a short 10,000 word short story with Aliette de Bodard for the Shine anthology of optimistic fiction that Solaris Books put out. But that was ages ago, and this was the first time I'd written something as long as a novella with anybody. But yeah, with Peter, it was a lot of fun. it was a lot of fun. I had a huge kind of attack of imposter syndrome at one point because I realized I was sitting in Peter Hamilton's office and he was opinion about something. And, having read like his earlier novels when I was just starting out before I'd been published or anything, that seemed like a huge turnaround. So, we sat down, we came up with an idea, we came up with a group of scenes we would need to illustrate this idea, and then we basically divided the scenes up. The story has like a main character who spends a lot of time alone on a spaceship investigating things, and then in the course of the novella, she visits a lot of different future societies. So Peter, being a consummate world builder, invented all these societies, and I did all the not all, but a large portion of the character stuff because the character stuff, as we mentioned earlier, that's very much my bag. And it was fun. We did things like played tricks because he would write a piece, send it over to me, I would write the next scene, send it back to him, and then he would write the next scene, so we could keep continuity rather than writing our bits separately and then trying to squash them together. So I would do things like I introduced a cat at one point
Okay.
that he wasn't expecting, and so when it came back in the next scene, the cat died of old age due to the effects of relativity, and
Okay.
it was him saying "no bloody cat," right? So we enjoyed it. I think it was fun.
Yeah, that does sound fun. So the novella, that novella is Light Chaser, and you also mentioned Ragged Alice, and I'm kind of amused by the idea of a Jack Reacher in Wales. So I think that's quite entertaining. But are you drawn to other genres, or do you feel very much that you found your sort of, you found the things you want to write, and that's what you want to carry on writing?
In a way, I mean, they say write what you love, and obviously from our discussion, you can tell I've loved sci-fi for the last 53 years. But I'm always open to stretching and trying new things. I think if I ever found myself just on a treadmill, just writing formulaic books, just like the one before, I would get very frustrated. So I have recently planned out a giant epic fantasy book.
Oh.
I sent that plan to my agent, but it may or may not ever come to pass, but it was a fun exercise trying that out. And I introduced, say, elements of horror into Stars and Bones, sort of playing with that. I'm not a huge horror fan, but I love John Carpenter's The Thing and Aliens, and I think you can see the influence of both of those, and maybe Event Horizon in that book as well.
Yeah, definitely. And you certainly went in for that. I mean, you said you're not kind of a big fan, but you made the horrific bits horrific. So yeah. I wanted to move on to Embers of War, because there's an adaptation on the way. It's been on the way for a few years, I think. Yeah. And you told me the last time I interviewed you that you'd read the pilot episode script, and I imagine you can't talk much about what's happening with that. But how does it feel to know that your characters, your story, your world, are going to be in the hands of other creators?
It feels great. I mean, I've met both the guys doing it, the scriptwriter and the editor. Scriptwriter Gary Graham and the the director. Breck Eisner, who did a lot of The Expanse. So I trust them. We've had a talk. They really want to keep it true to the spirit of the books. Obviously, there will be some changes because it's a vastly different medium. So, if there's an event that I allude to in a couple of paragraphs in the book, they actually have to construct a scene to dramatize it and show it. And there have been a few minor changes, but having read the script, as I said, read several iterations of the script, they've really nailed it. It's different because of the demands of TV, but it's essentially the same story and essentially the same characters. And I absolutely love it. And one of the other things they showed me was they created a sort of mock-up trailer for it.
Oh.
Which they're going to use in the pitch. So they used some illustrations from DeviantArt and a voiceover and music and stuff to introduce the main characters and the setting, and and present a few sort of excerpts read from the script with these pictures over the top, and it's fabulous. Like all the hair on my arms and my neck stood up watching it. It was just
wow, especially
at the end where it dissolved to Embers of War, based on the novels by Gareth L. Powell, and I was just like, holy shit. So I really hope it happens. But obviously it all was on pause during the strike, and as far as I know, they're going to circle back in January and try to work out when to pitch it to networks, but hopefully it will be very soon. So hopefully I will have some news soon, and I would absolutely love to see it. And I know some authors are like, well, how do you deal with people wanting to make changes? And I don't care, they're paying me. So but as well, I trust them because they know the medium and I don't. It's the same as, I trust my cover designers because they know how to do a cover and I don't. And I trust my editor because she knows how to whip a book into shape that will sell in that way. And I don't necessarily. So, I trust people to do their jobs. And I trust these guys. So, even if it never happens, it's been incredibly instructive experience.
Mm-hmm. And when you're writing, you have this unlimited budget. You can do whatever you want. Are there parts of Embers of War that you are kind of very excited to see how to see visualized, to see how to see put on the screen?
Oh yeah, and with CGI and what have you, they can do so much nowadays. However, there was one in the original draft of the script. They had the scene, which is the very first chapter of the book, where the crew is trying to rescue a crashed spaceship that's floating in the ocean, and they're standing on top of it trying to drill their way in. And when the director came on board, he took one look at that and said, "I'm not buying a water tank." So,
oh, that's great.
So that scene has to be rewritten. So it was instructive in that way as well.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was like there are things you can do and things you can't with budgets, and you can do certain things, but having a Titanic-sized water tank and all the problems of filming on water and what it's like, no. So it's interesting.
Yeah, that's a really interesting insight. Last year, Gollancz published an updated, expanded edition of About Writing, and I saw you posted on social media that this would make a really good Christmas gift, which I think is true. About Writing, and that's your guide for aspiring authors, originally published by Luna Press, and you run workshops too for writing and about writing or for writers, and I wonder, kind of, what advice have you received or read that has helped you as a writer the most?
When I was 16, my English teacher put me forward for a competition that was being run, I can't remember by who, in the local area, where you had to write a short story and like 3 opening chapters of a novel or something and send it in. And I didn't win, but what I did get was the opportunity to be critiqued by Diane Wynne-Jones.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so I went along, a very naive 16-year-old, met her for coffee in this sort of arty coffee house in Bristol. And she had the huge hair, looked quite witchy. Was lovely though, to quite a callow youth like me. But she went through the story. I still have her notes. She wrote some handwritten notes on it. And she was just saying things like, the heroine shouldn't gasp and sigh at this point. And, and she was quite brutal, but everything she said made sense.
Okay.
And I'd been writing in, as I said, I'd been reading Heinlein and Larry Niven and Arthur C. Clarke. And so I was writing in that quite dated sort of 60s style. And this was like 1985 or 86. And she kind of cut through all that. And she was like, you can't just have something happen because you want it to happen. It has to make sense in the story. It's not Monty Python's big foot coming down out of the ceiling. So it was kind of like my first critique from a professional. Before that, I'd been, doing A-level English, and in that you got points for using big words and, writing convoluted sentences. And she was like, no, let's the goal here is to communicate. And it really opened my eyes. And that was a huge revelation at that age. And then, a couple of years later, I went to university and studied creative writing for 3 years. And one of the visiting tutors was Helen Dunmore, the novelist. And so I would have kind of a weekly tutorial with Helen, where she would read things and read the aforementioned awful poetry and roll her eyes, say, Gareth. So it was, I was looking back, I was incredibly fortunate to have met those two and to have had a small amount of guidance from them at the crucial times in my development. So, yeah, I would say those were probably the best or most influential pieces of advice I've had.
The goal is to communicate is wonderful. That's a really crisp way of putting it.
Yeah, absolutely. As soon as your reader has to put down the book to go and look up a word, you've lost them, because they might not come back. So it's I'm not saying you should dumb down, but use technical terms and use long words advisedly. And it's something I pay a lot of attention to, is the rhythm of the text. I kind of hear it as a rhythm, and if I can hear if a word is in the wrong place because it's like a bum note, and it's like, this sentence doesn't flow. I need to, maybe I shouldn't use the word Weltanschauung. I should just say point of view. And so it's it's that kind of thing. I kind of have to get the flow right, get the rhythm right, and it's got to move smoothly so that the reader is kind of reading it without even realizing they're reading it, if you see what I mean. Their eyes are just skipping along, but they're experiencing the story.
Yeah. The ear is a great tool. I say that to my students when they're writing, that so often they don't read back and or sub-vocalize what they have on the page, and actually when you start doing that, you just notice things differently. So yeah, that is rhythm and the way things flow is crucial.
It's hugely important with dialogue as well. And especially if you've got several different characters, giving them all their own rhythm and their own vocabulary and their own kind of, it's like having a jazz combo. You have a trumpet, you've got a double bass, you've got a saxophone, you've got drums, and they all speak differently, but they're all playing the same tune. So it's the same way. You have people who maybe only speak using very Anglo-Saxon words, or people who speak using very kind of Norman words, and or people who don't use contractions, or people who use nothing but contractions, and it kind of helps distinguish the voices it's hugely important.
That's a really good point. I forget who it was who told me that one of the characters never used contractions to emphasize, or is that the Star Trek Next Generation thing, that Data never uses contractions?
I don't know. Or was it that movie with Jeremy Irons where he plays two twins?
Oh, it might be. I'm not sure what that is, though.
I can't remember what it's called now.
Dead Ringers.
they're both two sisters. Rachel Weisz has been starring in a remake of it, where she plays the two twins. Yeah, he plays two twins. And I think he was doing, for one of them, he always stood on the balls of his foot, and when he was being the other one, he always stood on the heel of his foot.
Oh, okay.
So you could tell from their posture which was which.
That's really cool. Fassbender does something really cool in I watched Alien Covenant and again recently, and he's very good at doing those two different versions of the same sort of, I guess that they're not the same at all, are they? But just doing two characters who seemingly are the same.
Yes. Yeah, I think I recently rewatched those two, Prometheus and Covenant, back to back, and if you do that as if they are one film, they seem to make a bit more sense, but only a bit. But you can follow David's story through it, because in Prometheus you don't realise he's the main character until you got to watch the two films back to back.
That's interesting.
But they still have some glaring nonsense in them. But Fassbender, as you say, incredible actor. It does a hugely great job. I think, and both films look gorgeous as well. It's just
they do. They just sort of do. Yeah, there were some strange moments, some strange decisions.
Yes. Let's leave it there.
Yeah, let's leave it there.
Because we'll open a whole can of worms.
Yeah, let's not do that. A couple more questions. The novelist and INTERZONE writer Kelly Jennings has a really great question, and I like to steal it. Kelly's kid pointed out to her once that all of her work was about revolutions. Right. And she hadn't really noticed that until her kid had pointed it out. And I wonder, kind of, when you look at sort of, or look for threads through your work, what would you say your work is about?
This is something I've given some thought to, and I kind of, if you look through my novels all the way back to Akak Makak and The Recollection and everything, they're all about characters who have lost someone or something, and they're all about characters who have a trauma in their background that they've. I think the Starship Trouble Dog says it at one point in Embers of War. Is the thing about humans is you've all been broken, but the way you've put yourselves back together is what makes you you and what makes you unique. And that seems to be very much a running theme through the books, alongside a lot of characters who aren't human, and characters who are almost human, and characters who were human and are now something else. Mm-hmm. So there's very much a kind of unpacking of what it means to be a person, what it means to be human, and looking at humans from the inside and the outside. Those seem to be the kind of themes that I notice, and I hope one day someone will do a dissertation on my work and they'll go back and tease out all this stuff I'm completely unaware of, and it'll, I'll find out I've been tremendously clever all this time without knowing.
It all happened organically. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a really powerful, loss, and of course you kind of take it to the maximum by we lose the whole planet, and then you sort of rebuild from that point. That is a really fascinating way to see it.
Yeah.
Before we go, is there anything you've been reading recently that you'd like to recommend or boost, or just that INTERZONE listeners might be interested in?
Well, obviously, I'd like to give a shout out to The Inn at the Amethyst Lantern by J. Diane Dotson, which is a lunapunk future mystery, sort of like echoes of the Goonies, but also some Stranger Things and some horror, but also some sci-fi and some fantasy. And it's really involving. And I read it chapter by chapter as she wrote it, and really, really enjoyed it. So I would heartily recommend that one. Mm-hmm. As well, recently I read Adrian Tchaikovsky's Final Architecture trilogy, which was brilliant. Not that Adrian needs publicity from the likes of me. He's, he's the big thing in UK sci-fi at the moment, and best of luck to him. What else? I've been going back and reading a lot of like Ursula Le Guin and Octavia Butler and stuff like that recently. So some Stephen King, because
okay.
Diane was horrified last year when she realised I'd never read The Stand. So she was like, right, I was over in the States at the time, so we went to a bookstore and bought a copy and like read that on the plane home. So yeah.
What did you think of it?
I got the expanded edition with all the stuff that was taken out of the first edition.
Okay,
so it's really long. So I'm still only about a third of the way through it. I can dip in and out of it from time to time, but I say there's a lot of stuff in there from the pandemic. I think I've got to be in a cheerful mood to read this. So.
Yeah,
especially as we were watching Last of Us as well at the time when I was reading it. So
that's too much altogether. Yeah.
That was a bit too much. So yeah, but I keep going back to it. It's I find his style very easy and involving. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, he's very readable. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I always wonder when you get these expanded editions. Kind of, well, I suppose it was taken out for a reason, but I suppose putting it back in does make sense for a particular audience. But yeah, it's a brick, isn't it? It's a really big one.
It's a proper rodent squasher. Yeah.
And your most recent books, Descendant Machine and Stars and Bones, are out wherever books are sold. And you have I've got to check my notes. And you have Future's Edge coming out not next year, the year after.
Yeah.
Is there anything else we should be looking out for, and where can people find you online?
Well, you can find me at www.garethlpowell.com. And I've recently mothballed my Twitter for reasons. And so I am most active on Instagram and Threads and Blue Sky. So people can find me on there as Gareth L. Powell. If you just find me on one of them, then I've got a Linktree link in the bio, so you can just click through and find all the other ones really easily. I'm always online, giving out advice, being positive, grumbling about things. It's
and talking about and often just like pulling books off your shelf and talking about them, which is always good. Always good to see kind of classics that people are going back to.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Gareth L. Powell, for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure. And I hope we can talk again when you have your next books out.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
You've been listening to INTERZONE Pod with me, Gareth Jelley, and my guest today, Gareth L. Powell. Find out more about INTERZONE and subscribe at interzone.press and read stories, reviews, interviews, and more for free in its sister zine, IZ Digital, at interzone.digital. Thanks for listening. See you next time.